This is my 2008, I believe, 2007 or 2008 Sportsman 90. It's got a noise when it's idling. I'll start it up here in a second so you can hear. The dealer diagnosed this off an old invoice I saw from the previous owner that it was a starter idler gear that was making the noise, and that does seem to match up. I'm going to start it here now so you can hear. I'm going to set the phone down. I'm going to get it down in here so you can hear where that sound's coming from. This machine runs really good, but that's a terrible sounding noise, and I've got some bigger machines now. My kids have outgrown this, so I'm going to fix that before I go ahead and move it on to its new owner. I was starting to disassemble this already and decided, well, maybe I better film this for somebody else that needs to know how to do it, or somebody else that has that noise, and maybe will solve the problem for them. So I'm going to go back over. I took the seat off. This is in here underneath the tank. And then your gas shutoff valve is in here. There's one of those plastic push pins here that you unscrew, and then you can pull the pin out. It's like a Phillips head. And then there's one here. You have to take the screw out of the shutoff valve, and then that exposes two more screws. Looks like these are also Phillips head. I tend to use a JIC even on the Phillips heads when I'm working on these, because actually the one that's in the center of that valve is a JIC rather than, JIS. Japanese Industrial Standard, I think is what it stands for. It looks like a Phillips head, but if you use Phillips, you tend to strip them out. But I've never stripped out a Phillips using a JIS, so I tend to just use JIS when I'm working on these things. So you pull that gas valve out, it will fall out of the way underneath, as you can see here. So we got that panel out of the way, then we'll remove this. Should be probably an 8mm nut on the back side, and then Phillips head on this side, and then these 10mm here, 4 of these. So I'll get all these out, and then I can remove this plastic panel, and we can access this case. Now, fortunately, this is a dry part of the case, so we won't have oil leaking out. Some machines, not this one, actually will have those starter gears inside a sealed part of the motor case, like on the other side. Fortunately, this one is not that way, but we will have to remove the CVT parts, at least on the front. You can see the starter here. Can't see it very well, but this is where the starter mounts, and it's pointed this way, so those starter gears are going to be in there. So I'll come back to you after we get this Kickstarter off, and then after we remove this panel here. So I was fighting with that kickstand, and actually you don't have to take the kickstand out to get this case off. I took a chance that maybe that was the case. So you can leave the kickstand on. That'll save you a lot of grief. In all likelihood, that probably won't come off there very easy. But then you remove these case bolts here. That's it there. They're all the same size, so you don't have to keep track of which one comes out of what hole. And there's 9 of them all the way around. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And then you have to loosen these clamps up. I don't have clamps on this side, but you'll have to loosen these clamps up. You can see that little dot on there. So that the little dot means that it is a JIS, just like this cap over the fuel shutoff valve. And so now we'll have to break these loose by twisting them or working a pick under there to break it loose, but then this case will come off. So what I'm talking about with these picks, in case you didn't know, of course you have to be careful not to poke through, but you work a pick under there, and then once it's under, you can work it around, and that will break off that seal that those things kind of make as they've been on there a while. So this one's worked in there pretty good, even though there hasn't been a clamp on it in quite some time. So I'm going to drop this camera so I can go ahead and work underneath it without poking through the rubber. So I've got the case off. In fact, there was a clamp on there. I just couldn't see it because the Phillips heads were tucked in behind here. So, of course, as I loosen that up, this side came off a little easier. It does take a little finagling to get it out of there. So this is that idler gear here. And as I wiggle that, it's not making much noise, but this starter clutch gear is loose. I'm going to get a light in there because I don't know if you can see what I'm talking about. As soon as I stick my hand in there, all the light goes away. So just a second. So here's what I'm talking about. That's the edge end of the starter there. This is what I would call the idler gear. Now maybe I'm just using the wrong nomenclature, and maybe this is actually the idler. But you can see that's moving around in there, and that means the starter clutch bolts have worked loose, which actually I just did repair on a Polaris Phoenix, and that's the same manufacturer of both these motors, is my belief. It's that Aeon, A-E-O-N, is the manufacturer of the motor on this one, I do believe. And so we're going to have to pull this stuff off of here so we can access that starter clutch, access the starter clutch bolts. I suspect we're going to find out they're loose in there, and maybe we'll just be able to tighten them up. I'm afraid probably in all likelihood we'll have to actually replace that starter clutch. So the next step is to take this bolt off the drive clutch. You're going to want to use an impact for this so you don't spin the motor over so much. Even a weak impact will generally take these off these small engines like this. I just use a 1/4 inch drive. Keep your things in order here so you don't lose track when you put them back on. That engages the teeth that are on this behind here. So when you're reassembling this, you'll have to be careful that this engages correctly and doesn't strip things out. So I'm going to set that aside. I'm going to pull off this drive sheave, I believe it's called. And there's a metal piece in here that engages. I think that's so it doesn't strip out so easy, because when this is all, this is all aluminum here. And it will strip out easily, so I think that's what this keyed washer is all about. Let's get our belt out of the way. We got to pull this back drive sheave off. There's a like a spacer in here, and then there's clutch weights on the back of this, so be careful taking this off. You'll have to grab a plate in behind it. I'll show you what I'm talking about here next. That washer's coming off with it, and that's perfectly fine. You can see this retains all those weights in there. That's how those weights work. They roll around, and then as they engage, this sheave kind of squeezes down, and that's how the CVT works. I'm not going to go into all the details of that, but anyway, let's put that back together so we don't lose those weights. Now you can see these don't look loose, but you can wiggle that gear around, and what attaches the gear to this starter clutch, the starter clutch only spins one direction. And what's happened is these bolts have come loose, and that's why that gear's loose back in there. So I think I'm going to remove this intermediate gear here, what I was calling an idler gear. Whether that's the right terminology or not, I don't know. I'm going to remove it so I can pull the rest of this starter clutch and gear off of here so I can inspect things a little closer. So I'm going to remove this intermediate gear. Those are 8mm headed bolts. There's one down here and one up here. That's just a little bit out of your camera view. We should be able to pull this guy out now. The washer in behind it, so don't lose that. So there's our intermediate gear, and there's the bolts that come out of it. Now we should be able to pull our starter clutch out. Now it's just this piece that is actually a starter clutch, so if you wanted to replace, well, here we've lost these bearings in here. You can see where they've ground out, these little ball bearings have come out. So anyway, looks like I probably need to install a new starter clutch and get a new bearing in there, because that bearing has come apart. So anyway, I'll get those on order and come back to you after I've got my parts. I'm going to show you a little closer what's happened to that bearing. There's the inner part of the bearing has come apart. There's those little balls from inside the bearing, as well as another piece of the bearing. It looks like we're probably going to have to get some, probably detach the clutch from the gear, and then we'll have to get some snap ring pliers to pull that out and get the outer part of the bearing out of there. I wanted to show you something. I was a little bit thrown off because the setup of this starter clutch is different from the unit I just took apart. Those screws have not worked their way loose. You can see as they were driven in, there's little divots there. They're retainers, and they have not worked out of the slots there where they've knocked notches into it so they don't back out. And this starter clutch is not physically attached to that gear in any way. It does just come off, and you can see the starter clutch weights in here. I think all that's just fine. I think we just got to deal with the bearing now. So first thing we got to do to get that bearing out of there is get some snap ring pliers. These are notoriously difficult to get out. Luckily we got it out first try. Every snap ring pliers I've had have been, seems like garbage. I bought these. These have been slightly better than some of the other ones I've had. It doesn't seem like jaws open up very well, but hey, if you like these, there you go. Channel Lock 926. They have replaceable jaws and so forth. I just want to make sure I can actually get that bearing out before I order a new bearing. I didn't find Polaris part numbers for any of these. Any of the parts breakdowns for Polaris, none of them had even this gear. So you can get these on eBay, generic Chinese parts, and of course even they don't have a Polaris cross-reference number. And most of the options are to buy this gear with the bearing in it, as well as the starter clutch in a package. It's not terribly expensive, but I thought before I buy just the bearing, which was an option, I better make sure I can get that bearing out. I figure there's some reason they're selling them as a package, so I'll tell you what my trick is if I can get that bearing out the rest of the way, because obviously it's been pressed in there So that bearing is coming out of there. I'm using a punch here. I'm just using a metal punch, and I'm grabbing that lip that's left from the other side and tapping it with a hammer. Sorry if you can't see it very well. This is the best angle I can come up with. It is actually coming out of there. I'd really like to do this on camera so you can see. I'm going to flip it over so I can tap the other direction. It's probably getting a little bit sideways in there now. Okay. There's a bearing. There's that, what might be something we have to save. Don't know about that, so we'll save that and wait for the new one to come in. It's finally out of there. There's our gear. When we reinstall the next one, I've got a press for that. Alternatively, I suppose you could heat this up with some MAP gas and then drop the bearing in. So our new bearing came in the mail. It's going to be a tight fit. I don't think I'm going to have to put this on the press. I think I'm going to be able to just put it up in the vise and press it in, because I can get it lined up like this. It's not going to be too terrible. I think this, what I thought, could have been a spacer, is probably just a shield off of the bearing that was originally in there. I'm not putting that in. I'm tossing that. You make your own judgment if you see that when you take yours off. I'm pretty confident it's just a part of the bearing that came out. Maybe it was worn down some. So there is a number on it. I thought there probably would be. I don't know if you can see that, so I'm going to read it to you. It says 6003, so 6003 RS. That is a cheap bearing that can be had. It would have been cheaper than what I had to pay for it. So anyway, I'm going to put that in a vise. I've got a socket that lines up with the metal on the outside. You don't really want to press on the middle there where that seal is. You want to press on the outside of that bearing if at all possible. You just have to be careful when you put it in your press or vise or hammer on it, that you're not, that you don't have your socket over here and so forth. Make sure it's going in straight too. And then we'll put our clip back in. I'll probably get back to you, I'll probably get back to you when it's all back together. So the bearing did go right in there. Of course, you've probably done this before if you're watching the video, but basically you line it up in your vise here and then press that bearing in, making sure everything's lined up, making sure it's not getting cattywampus, readjust as needed. But that did slide right in on the vise, didn't take a ton of force. Then I got my little retaining clip back in there using my fancy little cantankerous pliers. Now it's time to start reassembling all this. Here's the parts breakdown picture of those parts, so we make sure we're getting everything in the right order. There's where you can find that at. Well, here. I know it's a long string of numbers. It's hard to find online. I did finally find it. And there's evidence again that you cannot just purchase the bearing itself from Polaris. This is a whole unit here. So there's your parts and there's the orientation. Number 7 is what I was really concerned about. It's this guy here. Looks like it's brass or bronze or whatever. I don't know. I'm not great with that stuff. And I'm going to roll down this in case you need a different part number from that, just in case, just so you can see it. Get part numbers if you need. All right, I'm gonna put this camera up on the stand and we'll reassemble this starter clutch assembly or gear or whatever you want to call it. So we're ready to start reinstalling things. This gear here that we just put the bearing in, we really need to, of course, put our washer in. We really need to get our clutch engaged with this first, because you can see that gap there. That gap shouldn't be there. You can see these weights. They have to kind of be rolled back into their compressed position to be able to get around this, and you won't be able to do that later. So you really need to do that now, get that in position. So I'm going to get that worked on there now, and then we'll start putting everything back on, and I'll show you the position of everything for that part next. So we've got our starter clutch and gear assembly together. You can see there's not a gap in there, and this should only spin one direction. You can see as I try to spin this clockwise, it's not working, but counterclockwise it spins perfectly fine. Now we'll put that on. Next we put this, what I've been calling an intermediate gear, but it's actually called an idler gear. That guy goes next. Remember, there's a washer behind it that I've left on there. And you might have to work it back and forth so it engages. So that inner gear, the smaller gear, engages this, and the one you can't see from this camera angle, the larger gear engages the starter. All that should be engaged, and you really shouldn't be able to move it without a lot of force. You put quite a bit of force on it, you can move it. Now we got to put this retaining cap over that idler gear. Binding up on me on this bolt here. I'll finish tightening those up off camera as I prepare for the next step. Boy, if I can even get them started. There we go. Next is the back side of the sheave with our sleeve in the middle. Remember, you've got those clutch weights in there. Make sure all your rubber pieces are back on this plate here. There's 3 of them. And make sure all 6 of your weights are in their cavities and rolling around like they should. You kind of have to put your hand behind this sheave to make sure all that stays together. There we go. Next step is you're going to want to get your belt in there, and then we'll start on this part. We got those 2 bolts bolted down for that retainer for that idler gear. We got our belt in. Now it's time to put on this sheave. Don't forget this guy. So it will be a struggle a little bit, but you can get those gears to sit a little bit proud as you put some pressure in and work this belt around. Because you really have to get the teeth on this engaged before you start to tighten everything down, or else you'll end up damaging teeth on that gear. So we got that on. Got our washer on. And you have to keep pressure inward or that will come back apart. .14mm. You'll have to finish tightening this probably with the impact. But we got everything lined up now. I'm going to put the impact on that. I'm going to start this up so you can hear it run, so you can tell the noise has gone away. And I'm not going to bore you with the rest of reassembly here. All that stuff's pretty straightforward. The part you probably wanted to see is already done. So let's start this up. It's a cold start, so we may struggle a little bit, but there you go, noise is gone. Thanks for watching. Hope this was helpful.